Sometimes the greatest victories come not from breaking what stands before us, but from understanding it. In the small town of Red Mesa, a wealthy widow named Lillian set an impossible test for her suitors. Any man who wanted her hand had to tame her wild stallion, Diablo. 20 cowboys tried and failed. The black horse had never been ridden, never been broken. Then came Ben Turner, a poor ranch hand with nothing to offer but kindness. While others used force, Ben tried something different. He talked to the horse, moved slowly, and showed respect. By evening, he was riding Diablo across the ridge. But what was it about Ben's gentle approach that succeeded where strength had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Red Mesa stretched across the high desert like a promise half-kept, its adobe buildings baked the color of old leather under the relentless Arizona sun. The town had grown up around the railroad depot, where cattle cars loaded with beef from the surrounding ranches headed east to feed the growing cities. But for all its bustle and commerce, Red Mesa remained a place where a man's word still meant something, where neighbors knew each other's troubles, and where the biggest news traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a dust storm. At the center of all conversation, spoken and whispered, stood the Price Ranch. 15,000 acres of prime grazing land rolled away from the main house in waves of golden grass, cut by streams that never ran dry, even in the hardest summers. The house itself rose like a monument to prosperity, 2 stories of native stone and imported timber, with a wraparound porch that commanded views of the entire valley. But it wasn't the grandeur of the home that drew every eye and sparked every conversation. It was the woman who lived there alone, and the magnificent creature that ruled her corrals. Miss Lillian Price had been widowed 3 years now, though she wore her loss with the quiet dignity of a woman who understood that grief was a companion, not a master. At 32, she possessed the kind of beauty that deepened rather than faded with time, auburn hair that caught fire in the sunset light, eyes the color of sage after rain, and a spine that had never bent under the weight of others' expectations. She had inherited not just her husband's ranch, but his business acumen and his reputation for fairness in all dealings. Thomas Price had been 20 years her senior when they married, a gentle giant of a man who had built his fortune through hard work and honest dealing. He had courted her with patience, won her with kindness, and loved her with the devotion of a man who knew he had found something precious beyond measure. Their marriage had been the kind that made other couples envious, built on respect, sustained by laughter, and deepened by shared dreams of the life they would build together. But fate had other plans. A fall from his horse during a winter storm had taken Thomas as suddenly as lightning strikes, leaving Lillian with a ranch to run, a fortune to manage, and a heart that wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck like a shield against the world. The suitors had begun arriving within 6 months of the funeral, drawn by her wealth like moths to flame. They came with polished boots and practiced smiles, speaking of protection and partnership while their eyes calculated the value of her holdings. Some were gentlemen, others scoundrels, but all shared the same fundamental misunderstanding. They believed Lillian Price could be won like a prize at a county fair. It was then that Lillian devised her test, born from wisdom her husband had shared and her own understanding of what real partnership meant. Any man who wished to court her must first prove himself worthy by accomplishing what no man had yet managed, taming Diablo. The stallion stood 17 hands high, black as midnight, except for a white blaze that ran down his face like a lightning bolt, frozen in time. He had come to the ranch as part of a trade deal 2 years before Thomas's death, already full-grown and carrying the wild pride of Mustang blood in his veins. Thomas had planned to gentle him eventually, but the horse had proven as stubborn as he was magnificent. After her husband's death, Lillian had found in Diablo a kindred spirit, beautiful, valuable, and utterly unwilling to submit to just anyone's will. The townspeople of Red Mesa had watched the parade of hopeful suitors with the fascination of spectators at a traveling show. Each cowboy who stepped into that corral brought his own method, his own confidence, and his own inevitable defeat. There had been Jake Morrison from the Circle K, who lasted 8 seconds before Diablo sent him flying into the fence. Charlie Brewster from down in Phoenix tried using ropes and pulleys, only to have the Stallion break free and chase him clear out of the corral. Even Buck Sullivan, the rodeo champion from Tucson, who claimed he'd never met a horse he couldn't break, had limped away after Diablo deposited him in the water trough 3 times running. With each failure, the legend grew. Diablo became not just a horse, but a symbol of the impossible. Children would sneak close to the corral fence to glimpse the creature that had bested every man brave enough to try. Women would shake their heads and mutter that Lillian was being unreasonable, setting a test no mortal man could pass. The men, for their part, grew increasingly convinced that the Stallion was touched by something beyond the natural world. But Lillian watched each attempt with growing sadness rather than satisfaction. She had not created the test to humiliate these men, but to find one who understood that true partnership required patience, respect, and the willingness to see beyond the surface to the spirit beneath. Each failed attempt only reinforced her fear that such a man might not exist. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September when Ben Turner rode into Red Mesa. The autumn air carried the first hint of winter's approach, and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. Ben came from the south, leading a pack mule and riding a sorrel mare whose best days were clearly behind her. His hat was weathered to the color of old leather, his clothes clean but patched, and his boots worn thin at the heels. He stopped first at Murphy's General Store, where he inquired about work with the polite deference of a man accustomed to asking for help without losing his dignity. Sarah Murphy, whose tongue was known to wag faster than her husband's tail could, immediately began telling him about the Price Ranch and the impossible Stallion, and the beautiful widow who had set a test no man could pass. 20 good men have tried, she said, leaning across the counter with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing state secrets. Cowboys from here to California, each one thinking he'd be the one to break that devil horse. But that Diablo, he's got fire in his blood and no love for saddles, tosses them off like they was children. Ben listened with the quiet attention of a man who had learned that every story held lessons for those wise enough to hear them. He asked no questions about the widow's wealth or the size of her holdings. Instead, he inquired about the Stallion, where he had come from, how long he'd been on the ranch, whether anyone had tried gentle methods rather than force. Sarah's eyebrows rose at this line of questioning. Most men wanted to know about Lillian's beauty or her fortune. Few asked about the horse's history or suggested that breaking might not be the answer. Gentle methods? She repeated, as if he'd suggested taming a tornado with kind words. Mister, that horse is pure wildfire. He's got the devil's own temper and the strength to back it up. Gentle ain't gonna get you nowhere but trampled. Ben nodded thoughtfully, paid for his supplies, and asked directions to the Price Ranch. As he loaded his pack mule and prepared to leave town, word spread with the speed that only small communities can manage. By the time he had ridden the 5 miles to Lillian's front gate, half the town knew that another fool had come to try his luck with Diablo. The Price Ranch announced itself with an archway of wrought iron bearing the brand a simple P enclosed in a circle. The road leading to the house was lined with mature oaks that Thomas had planted as a young man, their branches now wide enough to shade a wagon. As Ben rode beneath them, he felt the weight of history and the presence of dreams carefully tended. Lillian was on her front porch when he arrived, as if she had been expecting him. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her coloring, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun that somehow managed to be elegant. Around her neck, barely visible above the dress's neckline, hung a thin gold chain. She watched him approach with the measured gaze of a woman who had learned to judge men quickly and accurately. Ben removed his hat as he stopped his horse at the base of the porch steps. "Miss Price," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of a man raised in the hill country. "I'm Ben Turner. I heard in town that you might have work for a man willing to earn his keep." "Work?" Lillian's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most men who come calling aren't looking for employment, Mr. Turner. Most men aren't me, ma'am." His smile was gentle, reaching his eyes in a way that suggested it came from genuine warmth rather than calculation. "I'm not looking for anything I haven't earned." Something in his tone made Lillian study him more carefully. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, but there was nothing flashy about him. His gear was well maintained but humble, his manner respectful without being servile. Most telling of all, his eyes held a depth that spoke of experience, both joy and sorrow, without bitterness. "You've heard about the test," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have, and if I may say so, ma'am, it sounds like a wise woman's way of sorting wheat from chaff." This answer surprised her. Most men either dismissed the test as foolishness or saw it as a challenge to their masculinity. Few understood its deeper purpose. 20 men have tried to tame Diablo," she said, watching his face for the usual flash of confidence or bravado. 20 men have failed." Ben nodded slowly. "I reckon a horse that's bested 20 good men has earned some respect. Might be the problem wasn't with the horse, and you think you can succeed where they failed. I think," Ben said carefully, "that maybe success looks different than what those 20 men imagined. A horse ain't a problem to be solved, Miss Price. He's a partner to be earned." Lillian felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition so unexpected it took her breath away. This stranger, this poor cowboy, with dust on his clothes and humility in his voice, had just spoken words that echoed her late husband's philosophy so closely they might have come from Thomas himself. "Would you like to see him?" she asked quietly. Ben smiled. "I'd be honored, ma'am." As they walked toward the corral behind the house, Lillian found herself stealing glances at this unusual man who spoke of horses as partners rather than conquests. Around her neck, her husband's ring seemed to grow warm against her skin, as if responding to a presence it recognized. The corral stood empty when they arrived, but the evidence of recent violence remained etched in the churned earth and splintered fence rails. Ben knelt and touched the ground, reading the story written in hoofprints and disturbed soil like pages in a book, deep gouges where iron shoes had struck, scattered gravel thrown by powerful haunches, a dark stain near the gate that spoke of blood spilled. "Jake Hoffman tried yesterday," Lillian said quietly. "He came highly recommended from a ranch in Colorado. Claimed he'd broken over 100 horses." Ben stood, brushing dust from his hands. "What happened to him?" "Doc Peterson's keeping him overnight for observation. Possible concussion." Lillian's voice carried no satisfaction, only weary resignation. "Diablo threw him into the gatepost within minutes. As if summoned by his name, the stallion appeared at the far end of the adjacent pasture. Even at a distance of 50 yards, his presence commanded attention. Diablo moved with the fluid grace of unleashed power, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the afternoon sun. But it was his eyes that told the real story, wild, intelligent, and filled with a wariness that ran deeper than simple fear. Ben watched the horse with the patience of a man who understood that first impressions mattered as much to animals as they did to people. Diablo approached the fence line with the controlled aggression of a creature that had learned to expect conflict. His ears laid back, his nostrils flared, and every line of his body spoke of readiness for battle. "He's magnificent," Ben said softly. "He's dangerous," Lillian replied, though her tone suggested she shared Ben's admiration. "I sometimes wonder if I've created an impossible test. Maybe no man can tame him." "Maybe," Ben agreed. "Taming isn't what he needs." Before Lillian could ask what he meant, voices carried across the ranch yard. 3 men approached from the direction of the main house, their spurs ringing against the hard-packed earth. Ben recognized the type immediately, cowboys with more swagger than sense, the kind who measured their worth by how quickly they could break a horse's spirit. The leader was a tall man, with carefully waxed mustaches and silver conchos decorating his vest. His companions flanked him, like supporting actors in a play about their own importance. All 3 wore the confident smirks of men who believed they had come to witness another easy victory. "Miss Price," the leader called out, touching his hat brim with theatrical courtesy. "I heard tell there was another challenger come to try his luck with your devil horse." Lillian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Garrison, I thought you'd returned to Flagstaff." "Had business in town," Wade Garrison replied, his eyes moving dismissively over Ben's humble appearance. "Couldn't resist stopping by to watch the entertainment, though I have to say, this one doesn't look like he'll last as long as poor Jake did." Ben remained silent, his attention focused on Diablo rather than the newcomers. The stallion had moved closer to the fence, drawn perhaps by the tension in the air or simply by curiosity about the gathering crowd. "You the one thinks he can ride that black demon?" Garrison asked Ben directly. "I'm the one who'd like to get acquainted with him," Ben replied mildly. Garrison's companions laughed. "Get acquainted," one of them repeated. "Son, that horse ain't looking for friendship, he's looking for a fight. Maybe that's because fighting's all he's been offered," Ben said. The simple statement landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. Garrison's smile turned sharp-edged. "You got some theory about horse breaking that's different from what's worked for generations." "I got some experience with creatures that have been hurt," Ben replied. "Sometimes what looks like meanness is just pain, wearing a different face." Lillian found herself studying Ben with new attention. There was something in his voice, a depth of understanding that suggested personal experience with the subject of pain disguised as anger. "Well, this ought to be interesting," Garrison said, settling himself against the fence like a man preparing for a show. "Go ahead, friend. Show us how your gentle ways work on a horse that's already put 20 good men in the dirt." Ben looked at Lillian. "With your permission, ma'am, I'd like to spend some time with him, not trying to ride him or break him, just letting him get used to my presence." "That's it?" Garrison scoffed. "You're going to make friends with him? That's the idea." Lillian felt something stir within her, a mixture of hope and fear that this man might actually understand what she'd been looking for all along. "Mr. Turner, are you certain you want to attempt this? I won't think less of you if you change your mind." Ben's smile was gentle but determined. "I appreciate that, Miss Price, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." She nodded and opened the gate. Diablo's reaction was immediate and violent. The stallion reared, his front hooves pawing the air as he issued a challenge that echoed off the barn walls. When he came down, he began moving in tight circles, his tail flagged high and his neck arched in aggressive display. Ben stepped into the corral and immediately did something that shocked every observer. He sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, about 10 feet from the gate. Then he simply waited. "What in the hell is he doing?" one of Garrison's men whispered. "Making himself look foolish," Garrison replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Diablo continued his aggressive display for several minutes, but gradually his movements slowed. The stallion's attention was clearly focused on this strange human who had entered his domain, but made no threatening moves. Ben remained motionless, his hands resting peacefully on his knees, his breathing slow and steady. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Diablo stopped circling. He stood at the far end of the corral, sides heaving, ears pricked forward now instead of laid back. His entire posture spoke of confusion. This wasn't how the game was supposed to be played. Ben began to speak, his voice so low that those outside the fence had to strain to hear. "Easy there, big fellow. I know you're wondering what kind of fool just walked into your territory without so much as a rope or a bridle. Truth is, I'm wondering the same thing." His tone was conversational, almost casual. But I've got time, and you've got my attention. Seems like a fair trade." Diablo's ears swiveled, tracking the sound of Ben's voice. The stallion took a cautious step forward, then stopped. "That's it," Ben continued. "No hurry. We've got all the time in the world to figure each other out." Lillian found herself holding her breath. In all the attempts she'd witnessed, no challenger had ever simply sat down and talked to Diablo. Most came armed with ropes and spurs and determination to show the horse who was master. But Ben sat in the dirt like he was visiting with an old friend on a front porch. "What's he doing?" Garrison asked, but the mockery had gone out of his voice. "Something different," Lillian replied softly. As if sensing the change in atmosphere, Diablo took another step forward, then another, his neck stretched out, nostrils working to catch Ben's scent. Ben remained perfectly still, continuing his one-sided conversation. "I bet you've got stories to tell," he said. "I bet you remember every person who came in here thinking they could break you down to nothing. But that's not what I'm here for, friend. I'm here to see if maybe we can work something out together." Diablo was now halfway across the corral, close enough that Ben could see the intelligence in the stallion's dark eyes. Close enough to see something else, a thin scar across the horse's left shoulder, barely visible beneath the black coat. Ben's expression grew thoughtful. "Someone hurt you," he said quietly. "Someone used force when they should have used patience. I'm sorry for that." As if the words had touched something deep within him, Diablo suddenly pinned his ears and bared his teeth. But instead of charging, he simply stood there, trembling with emotion that ran deeper than mere aggression. Ben slowly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small. Sugar cubes, the kind cowboys carried for trail horses. He placed one on the ground in front of him and then resumed his patient waiting. The sun was beginning to set when Diablo finally approached close enough to investigate the offering. His lips, soft as velvet despite his fearsome reputation, gently picked up the sugar cube. For just a moment, horse and man regarded each other with mutual respect rather than suspicion. Then Diablo wheeled and galloped to the far end of the corral, but his movement lacked the earlier violence. It was more like a declaration: "I choose to leave, not because you drove me away." Ben rose slowly, brushing dust from his clothes. When he turned toward the fence, he found Lillian watching him with something like wonder in her eyes. "That was remarkable," she said quietly. Garrison and his companions had long since departed, apparently finding the lack of violence less entertaining than they'd hoped. Only Lillian remained, and in her gaze, Ben saw the first glimmer of possibility, not just for taming a horse, but for something far more precious. "Tomorrow?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow," she agreed. As they walked back toward the house, neither spoke of what they'd witnessed, but hanging in the air between them was the recognition that something had begun, something that might change everything for both woman and man, if they had the courage to see where patience and understanding might lead. Dawn broke over the Price Ranch with the gentle warmth of autumn sunlight filtering through the cottonwoods. Ben had risen before first light, as was his habit, and made his way to the corral with a small cloth bag in his pocket. The sugar cubes inside rattled softly with each step, simple treats that represented something far more significant than their humble nature suggested. Diablo stood at the far fence, his magnificent head turned toward the approaching figure. There was no tension in the stallion's posture this morning, no aggressive display of dominance. Instead, there was something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps the faintest beginning of recognition. Ben settled himself in the same spot where he'd sat the previous evening, cross-legged in the dirt with his back to the morning sun. He pulled a sugar cube from his pocket and placed it on the ground before him, then began the patient waiting that had become his method. "Morning, friend," he said quietly. "Hope you slept well. I've been thinking about you, wondering what kind of life you had before you came here." From the ranch house porch, Lillian watched through her kitchen window as she prepared coffee. She had awakened thinking about the previous evening's encounter, replaying in her mind the gentle way Ben had spoken to Diablo. Most men who came to attempt the test arrived with confidence, bordering on arrogance. Ben had brought something different, a humility that suggested he understood he was asking for a privilege, not demanding a right. The coffee finished brewing, and on impulse, Lillian poured 2 cups. She had told herself she was simply being neighborly, but as she walked toward the corral, she admitted that her motivations ran deeper. There was something about Ben Turner that intrigued her, something that made her want to understand the man who thought horses could be partners rather than possessions. "Mr. Turner," she called softly as she approached, "I thought you might appreciate some coffee." Ben turned and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with genuine warmth. "That's very kind of you, Miss Price. I'd be grateful." She handed him the steaming cup through the fence rails, careful not to disturb his patient vigil. "Any progress this morning?" "Look for yourself," Ben said, nodding toward Diablo. The stallion had moved to within 20 feet of where Ben sat, close enough that his individual features were clearly visible. The white blaze down his face caught the morning light like a banner, and his dark eyes held an alertness that spoke of interest rather than alarm. "He's never approached anyone this closely," Lillian said with wonder. "Not even me, and I feed him every day." "He's thinking," Ben observed, "trying to figure out if I'm different from the others. Animals are good judges of character, better than most people give them credit for." They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence, both watching as Diablo began a slow, cautious approach. The stallion would take a few steps forward, then stop and assess, his nostrils working to catch every nuance of scent and sound. "Where did you learn to work with horses this way?" Lillian asked. Ben was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. "My grandfather," he said simply. "He raised me after my parents died, had a small ranch up in the hill country of Texas. He always said that breaking a horse was like breaking a person's spirit. It might make them obedient, but it killed what made them special. He sounds like a wise man." "He used to say that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect, not dominance. Took me years to understand what he meant." Lillian found herself leaning against the fence rail, drawn into the conversation, despite her usual caution around strangers. "And do you understand now?" Ben's smile held a touch of sadness. "I understand that forcing someone to submit isn't the same as earning their trust. I understand that real strength sometimes looks like patience." The words resonated with something deep in Lillian's heart. How many of her suitors had tried to overwhelm her with displays of wealth or masculine bravado? How many had failed to see that what she truly sought was a partner who understood that love, like trust, had to be freely given? Diablo had continued his approach during their conversation and now stood just 10 feet away, his great head lowered as he studied the human who sat so still and spoke so softly. Ben placed another sugar cube on the ground, slightly closer to himself than the first. "That's it, big fellow," he murmured. "Take your time. No pressure." From the direction of the main road came the sound of approaching horses. Lillian sighed as she recognized the riders, 3 of the town's most persistent gossips, no doubt coming to witness the latest attempt at taming Diablo. Ben's methods were so different from previous challengers that word had spread quickly through Red Mesa. "Trouble?" Ben asked, noting her expression. "Just curious neighbors," Lillian replied. "My test has become something of a spectacle, I'm afraid." The riders approached with the barely contained excitement of people, hoping to witness either triumph or disaster. At their head rode Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the banker's wife and unofficial chronicler of all noteworthy events in Red Mesa. "Good morning, Lillian dear," Mrs. Hutchins called out as she reined in her horse. "We heard you had another challenger. Thought we might observe the proceedings." Lillian forced a polite smile. "Mr. Turner is taking a different approach than previous suitors." "Different how?" asked Martha Stevens, the schoolteacher, craning her neck to see into the corral. "He's sitting in the dirt talking to the horse," observed the third rider, Tom Bradley from the telegraph office. "Doesn't look like much of a challenge to me." Ben seemed unperturbed by the audience. If anything, his posture grew even more relaxed, as if the presence of observers meant nothing compared to the delicate communication happening between him and Diablo. The stallion, however, reacted to the new arrivals with suspicion. His head came up sharply, ears swiveling toward the sound of multiple voices. For a moment, it seemed he might retreat to the far end of the corral. "Easy," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the horse's ears. "They're just curious, folks. Nothing to worry about." Remarkably, Diablo settled at the sound of Ben's voice. The stallion's attention returned to the man sitting patiently in the dirt, and after a moment's hesitation, he stepped forward and delicately picked up the second sugar cube. The observers gasped collectively. Mrs. Hutchins leaned so far forward in her saddle that her horse shifted nervously beneath her. "I've never seen anything like it," Martha whispered. 20 men have tried to ride that devil," Tom added, shaking his head in amazement, "and this fellow's got him eating out of his hand." Ben remained focused on Diablo, ignoring the commentary from the fence. He placed a third sugar cube on the ground, this one close enough that the stallion would have to come within arm's reach to claim it. "Your choice, friend," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Diablo stood motionless for long minutes, clearly wrestling with instincts that warned against trusting any human. The voices of the observers faded to whispers, then to silence, as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Finally, with a movement so careful it seemed choreographed, Diablo stretched his magnificent neck forward and gently lifted the sugar cube from Ben's outstretched palm. For just an instant, the stallion's soft muzzle brushed against Ben's fingers, the first physical contact between man and horse. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom Bradley breathed. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Ben's face light up with quiet triumph. This was what she had been hoping for, praying for, through 20 failed attempts. Not domination or conquest, but understanding. Not breaking, but building. As the morning sun climbed higher and the observers eventually departed with their news, Ben continued his patient vigil. And slowly, step by careful step, Diablo began to trust. By the third evening, Ben had established a routine that the entire ranch seemed to revolve around. He would arrive at the corral just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, carrying with him not only sugar cubes, but something else that had surprised everyone, a small, worn harmonica that he'd pulled from his vest pocket as he settled into his familiar position in the dirt. The first time he'd played it, Diablo had startled and retreated to the far fence. But Ben had simply continued playing soft, slow melodies, songs his grandfather had taught him during long evenings on the Texas plains. There was something about the gentle music that seemed to speak to the stallion in a way that words could not, a language that transcended the barriers between species. Now, as Ben began his evening serenade, Diablo would approach without hesitation, drawn by both the promise of sugar and the soothing sounds that had become as much a part of their ritual as the patient conversations. "Amazing," Lillian murmured as she watched from her usual spot against the fence rail. She had taken to bringing coffee for both of them, and their evening conversations had become as much a part of her day as Ben's sessions with Diablo were becoming part of his. "Music's got power," Ben replied, pausing between songs. "My grandfather used to say it could gentle a wild heart faster than any rope or spur." The harmonica's silver surface caught the last rays of sunlight as Ben lifted it to his lips again. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a slow, mournful tune that spoke of longing and loss, but also of hope. Diablo's ears pricked forward, and he moved close enough that Ben could have reached out and touched the white blaze on his face. "What's that song?" Lillian asked softly. "Something my grandmother used to hum while she worked in her garden. Never knew if it had a proper name." Ben lowered the harmonica and placed another sugar cube on the ground. "She said it was about things that grow in their own time, when they're ready." The words carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on Lillian. She found herself studying Ben's profile in the golden evening light, noting the way his eyes softened when he looked at Diablo, the gentle patience in every line of his body. Here was a man who understood that the most precious things in life couldn't be forced or hurried. Their peaceful evening was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats and jangling spurs. A rider approached from the direction of town, his horse lathered with sweat as if he'd been pushed hard. As he drew closer, Lillian recognized Marcus Blackwood, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, and a man whose interest in her had been both persistent and unwelcome. Marcus cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threads in his dark hair and clothes that spoke of money spent on appearance. His saddle was tooled leather with silver conchos, his spurs were polished to mirror brightness, and everything about him proclaimed success and power. "Lillian," he called out as he dismounted with theatrical flourish. "I came as soon as I heard the news. Someone told me you had yet another challenger attempting your impossible test." His eyes moved dismissively over Ben's humble appearance, taking in the patched clothes and worn boots with the practiced assessment of a man who judged worth by material possessions. When his gaze fell on the harmonica in Ben's hands, his smile turned condescending. "I see he's trying to serenade the beast into submission," Marcus said with a laugh that held no warmth. "Novel approach. I'll give him that." Diablo, who had been standing peacefully near Ben, immediately tensed at the newcomer's presence. The stallion's ears went back, and he began moving in tight circles, his earlier calm replaced by the familiar signs of agitation. "Easy, friend," Ben said quietly, but Diablo was already retreating to the far end of the corral, spooked by Marcus's aggressive energy. "See?" Marcus spread his hands as if the stallion's reaction proved his point. "That horse can sense weakness. What he needs is a firm hand, not lullabies." "What he needs," Ben replied mildly, "is respect." Marcus's smile sharpened. "Respect? From a horse? Son, I've been breaking horses since before you could walk. Animals understand one thing, dominance. Show them who's boss, and they'll follow. Coddle them like you're doing, and they'll walk all over you. Is that your philosophy with everything?" Ben asked, his tone remaining conversational, despite the challenge in his words. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he recognized the implied criticism, and his voice took on an edge when he replied, "My philosophy has made me one of the most successful ranchers in Arizona territory. I have 10,000 head of cattle, a ranch house that's the envy of every territory official, and enough influence to get things done when they need doing." His gaze shifted to Lillian. "I can offer a woman security, protection, and a place in society. What can you offer, Cowboy?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on Diablo, who had stopped his agitated movement but remained at a distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "I can offer patience when others would use force, understanding when others would use judgment, and time, all the time needed for trust to grow naturally." The words were spoken to answer Marcus's question, but Ben's eyes were on Lillian as he said them, and she felt her heart skip a beat at the deeper meaning she heard beneath the surface. Marcus snorted derisively. "Pretty words don't put food on the table or protect a ranch from rustlers and claim jumpers. A woman needs a man who can take action when action's required. A woman needs a man who sees her as a partner, not a possession," Ben replied quietly. The statement landed like a physical blow. Marcus's face flushed red, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip before he caught himself. The gesture was small, lasting only a second, but it was enough to reveal the violence that lurked beneath his civilized veneer. "You're making a mistake, Lillian," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This saddle tramp will charm you with his soft words and gentle ways, but when trouble comes, and it will come, he'll fold like a house of cards. You need a real man, not some dreamer who thinks horses can be tamed with sugar cubes and songs." "I think," Lillian said quietly, "that I'm capable of making my own decisions about what I need, Marcus." For a moment, the rancher's mask slipped completely, revealing the entitled fury of a man unaccustomed to being denied anything he wanted. Then he visibly composed himself, straightening his shoulders and adjusting his hat with deliberate precision. "Of course you are," he said, his tone now falsely reasonable. "I just hate to see you waste your time on someone who's clearly not worthy of your attention." As Marcus mounted his horse and rode away, his parting glance at Ben carried the promise of future conflict. The peaceful evening had been shattered, but in its aftermath, something else had been revealed. The true character of both men, laid bare for Lillian to see and judge. In the corral, Diablo had begun to approach again, drawn back by Ben's renewed harmonica playing. The simple melody seemed to restore the peace that Marcus's presence had disturbed, and gradually the stallion's trust began to rebuild. "He doesn't like being told no," Lillian observed quietly. "Men like that rarely do," Ben replied. "They mistake taking for earning, and they can't understand why that doesn't work with the things that matter most." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ben played one last song on his harmonica, a gentle lullaby that seemed to settle over the ranch like a blessing. Diablo stood close enough now that his breath misted in the cooling air just inches from Ben's face, and the trust between them grew stronger with each shared moment of peace. The morning after Marcus's visit dawned grey and overcast, with clouds gathering over the mountains like an omen of troubles to come. Ben arrived at the corral to find an expensive buggy parked near the ranch house and a collection of wrapped packages on Lillian's front porch. Through the kitchen window, he could see Lillian speaking with a well-dressed woman who gestured animatedly as she talked. Diablo seemed to sense the tension in the air. The stallion paced restlessly near the far fence, his usual morning calm, replaced by an edginess that reminded Ben uncomfortably of the horse's behavior when Marcus had been present. Animals, Ben had learned long ago, were often better judges of character and situation than the humans around them. Ben settled into his familiar spot and began playing his harmonica, hoping the music would settle both Diablo's nerves and his own growing unease. The melody he chose was one his grandfather had taught him, a song about weathering storms and finding calm after trouble past. The kitchen door opened, and Lillian emerged with her visitor. Ben could see immediately that this was a woman of means and social position. Her dress was the latest fashion from back east. Her jewelry was real gold, and everything about her proclaimed refinement and wealth. She walked with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "And this must be the famous horse tamer," the woman said as they approached the corral. Her voice carried the cultured tones of finishing school education, but underneath lay something calculating. "I confess, Mr. Turner, you're not quite what I expected." Lillian's expression was carefully neutral as she made introductions. "Ben, this is Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, Marcus's sister. She's visiting from San Francisco." Ben rose respectfully, removing his hat. "Ma'am." Victoria's eyes moved over him with the frank assessment of someone evaluating livestock. Her smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. "Marcus has told me so much about you. He seems quite concerned about your influence on dear Lillian." "Mrs. Blackwood brought some lovely gifts," Lillian said, her tone suggesting the presents had been neither requested nor particularly welcome. "Silk from China, perfume from Paris. A woman of your beauty and position deserves the finest things life has to offer," Victoria replied smoothly. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to find you spending your mornings watching a hired hand play with livestock." The insult was delivered with such sweet politeness that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Ben felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level when he replied, "I'm not hired help, ma'am. I'm here by Miss Price's invitation, attempting something that's proven challenging for others." "Yes," Marcus explained, "about your unique approach." Victoria's laugh was like ice breaking on a winter pond. "Tell me, how exactly does playing children's songs accomplish what proper horsemanship couldn't?" Before Ben could answer, Diablo approached the fence where they stood. The stallion had been drawn by the sound of Ben's voice, but his attention was immediately caught by something else, the silver spurs that hung from Victoria's buggy seat, gleaming in the grey morning light. The horse's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared back with a scream of rage that echoed across the ranch yard, his eyes rolling white with terror and fury. His front hooves struck the fence rails with enough force to make the entire structure shake, and he began the aggressive circling that Ben had witnessed on his first day. Good heavens! Victoria stepped backward, her hand pressed to her chest. That creature is absolutely savage. But Ben wasn't watching Victoria. His attention was focused entirely on Diablo, and what he saw made his heart clench with understanding. The stallion wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Those silver spurs had triggered something deep and traumatic, a memory so painful it had instantly transformed the gentle creature Ben had been working with, back into the wild, defensive animal that 20 men had failed to tame. "Where did you get those spurs?" Ben asked quietly, his eyes never leaving the horse. Victoria's hand moved protectively toward the buggy. "They belonged to my late father. He was quite the horseman in his day. Why do you ask?" "Because your father's spurs just undid a week's worth of trust building," Ben replied, his voice carrying a hard edge that made both women look at him sharply. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made Ben's stomach turn. Diablo's scars, his violent reaction to traditional breaking methods, his terror of silver spurs, it all pointed to a history of abuse that went far beyond simple rough handling. "Your father owned Diablo before he came here," Ben said. It wasn't a question. Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something uncomfortable beneath. "I wouldn't know. Father owned many horses over the years. But you remember this one." Ben's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Because this one fought back. This one wouldn't break, no matter what your father did to him." "I think you're being rather impertinent, Mr. Turner," Victoria said, but her protest lacked conviction. Lillian had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, not just at Ben's accusations, but at Diablo's continued distress. The stallion was now throwing himself against the fence with such violence that she feared he might seriously injure himself. "Ben," she said urgently, "can you calm him?" Ben was already moving toward the gate, but he stopped with his hand on the latch. "Those spurs need to be removed from his sight first. As long as they're here, he'll see nothing but the man who tortured him." Victoria drew herself up with offended dignity. "I will not be accused of—" "Then prove me wrong," Ben interrupted. "Take the spurs away. If I'm mistaken, removing them won't make any difference. If I'm right, it might save your life. Because if that horse breaks through this fence while he's in this state, he'll kill anyone, wearing or carrying anything that reminds him of his tormentor." The stark warning hung in the air like a threat. Victoria looked at Diablo's frenzied state, at the fence rails already splintering under his assault, and made her decision. With visible reluctance, she retrieved the spurs from her buggy and carried them out of sight behind the ranch house. The change in Diablo was immediate and dramatic. The moment the silver disappeared from view, his violent thrashing stopped. He stood trembling in the center of the corral, sides heaving, but the murderous rage had left his eyes. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Victoria whispered, her face pale with shock. "How did you know?" Ben was already through the gate, moving slowly toward the traumatized stallion. "Because I've seen what cruelty does to a spirit," he said without turning around, "and I've learned to recognize the signs." He began playing his harmonica again, the gentle melody, a stark contrast to the violence they'd just witnessed. Gradually, note by note, he coaxed Diablo back from the edge of panic, rebuilding the trust that had been so brutally shattered. Victoria stood watching in stunned silence, the silver spurs clutched in her hands like evidence of a crime she was only now beginning to understand. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "I was just a child when Father owned him. I remembered the horse because he was so beautiful and because Father was always so angry after trying to ride him." She paused, then added quietly, "I never understood why Father kept him if he caused so much trouble." "Because your father couldn't stand the idea of being beaten by a horse," Ben replied, his attention still focused on Diablo. Men like that see everything as a contest to be won, not a relationship to be built. The words carried an unmistakable parallel to her brother's pursuit of Lillian, and Victoria had the grace to blush at the implication. She stood for several more minutes, watching as Ben slowly restored peace to the corral, then quietly gathered her gifts and departed without another word. As her buggy disappeared down the road, Lillian approached the fence, where Ben continued his patient work with Diablo. The stallion was now close enough to touch, his trust gradually returning despite the morning's trauma. "How did you know?" she asked softly. Ben's answer came without hesitation. "Because I recognized the fear. I've seen it before, in creatures that learn to associate human contact with pain." He paused in his playing and looked directly at her. "Sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't learning to trust again. It's forgetting what taught you not to trust in the first place." 3 days after Victoria's visit, the evening air carried the scent of approaching rain as Ben worked quietly in the barn, crafting something that no one in Red Mesa had ever seen before. By lamplight, his weathered hands moved with surprising delicacy, braiding together strands of horsehair that Diablo had naturally shed over the past weeks. The work was painstaking, requiring patience and skill that spoke of knowledge gained through years of practice. Lillian found him there as she made her evening rounds, checking on the animals before the storm arrived. She stopped in the doorway, watching as Ben's fingers worked the dark strands into an intricate pattern that was both beautiful and functional. "What are you making?" she asked softly, not wanting to disturb his concentration. Ben looked up with a smile that seemed to light the entire barn. "A halter," he said, holding up his work for her inspection. "Made from Diablo's own hair. If he's going to wear anything, it should be something that's already part of him." The simple statement carried profound meaning. Here was a man who understood that true partnership required respect for the other's dignity, who saw that forcing external constraints was less effective than creating bonds that honored the natural connection between them. "That's beautiful," Lillian said, running her fingers along the braided rope. The horsehair was smooth as silk, darker than midnight, and worked into a pattern that was both strong and elegant. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My grandfather again," Ben replied, returning to his work. "He said that everything you need to build a relationship with a horse, the horse will give you freely if you're patient enough to receive it." Lillian settled onto a nearby hay bale, drawn by something in Ben's voice that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the barn roof, creating an intimate cocoon of warmth and light in the gathering darkness. "Tell me about him," she said. "Your grandfather." Ben's hands never stopped moving, but his expression grew distant with memory. "Samuel Turner, toughest man I ever knew, and the gentlest. Lost his son, my father, in the war, then took in a scared, angry boy who thought the world owed him something for taking his parents away." "How old were you?" 8. "Old enough to remember my folks, young enough to think their death was somehow my fault." Ben's voice carried the echo of old pain, softened by time and understanding. "I was full of rage in those days, ready to fight anything that moved. Grandpa could have beaten it out of me, the way some men would have. Instead, he put me to work with the horses." The rain was falling steadily now, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that seemed to encourage confidences. Lillian found herself leaning forward, drawn into Ben's story by the quiet honesty in his voice. "There was this mare," Ben continued, "a rescue from a ranch where they'd used her hard and put her away wet too many times. She was head shy, wouldn't let anyone near her face. Grandpa told me that Mare and I had something in common. We'd both learned that the world was a dangerous place where bad things happened to good creatures." "What did you do?" "Spent every day for 6 months, just sitting in her stall, talking to her the way I'm talking to you now. Didn't try to touch her, didn't try to force her to trust me. Just showed up, every day, with patience and time." Ben held up the nearly completed halter, checking the tension of his braiding. "One day, she finally let me touch her nose. By the end of that summer, She'd follow me around like a dog. Grandpa said I'd learned more about healing in those 6 months than most people learn in a lifetime. And you think Diablo needs the same kind of healing? Ben nodded slowly. I think we all do, in our own ways. Life has a way of teaching us to protect ourselves, sometimes so well that we forget how to let good things in. The words hung between them, laden with meaning that extended far beyond horses and healing. Lillian felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of defenses she'd held in place since Thomas's death. Here was a man who understood that her test hadn't been about finding someone strong enough to dominate a wild stallion. It had been about finding someone wise enough to see that strength and wildness didn't have to be broken to be beautiful. "Why haven't you married?" she asked suddenly, then felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her boldness. "I'm sorry. That was presumptuous." "No, it's a fair question." Ben's smile was gentle, understanding. "I was married once. Sarah was her name. Prettiest girl in 3 counties, with a laugh that could make the angels weep with envy." Lillian felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. "What happened?" "Cholera took her the winter after we wed. She was carrying our first child." Ben's voice remained steady, but Lillian could see the cost of the words in the tightness around his eyes. "Lost them both in the space of a week. After that, I couldn't see much point in staying in one place. Been drifting ever since, looking for something I couldn't name. And have you found it?" Ben looked directly at her then, his brown eyes holding depths of warmth and possibility that made her breath catch. "I'm beginning to think maybe I have." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in its implications. Outside, thunder rumbled across the valley, but inside the barn, the only sound was the soft whisper of horsehair sliding through Ben's skilled fingers. "Lillian," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. I didn't come here for your money or your land, or even for the challenge of taming Diablo. I came here because I was tired of running from the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still something beautiful waiting for me in this world." Before Lillian could respond, the barn door slammed open with a crash that made them both jump. Marcus Blackwood stood silhouetted against the storm, water streaming from his hat and coat, his face dark with an anger that seemed to feed off the lightning flashing behind him. "Cozy little scene," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, the widow and the drifter playing house while her future hangs in the balance. "Marcus," Lillian said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster, "what are you doing here? Looking out for your interests, since you seem incapable of doing it yourself." His eyes moved to Ben with undisguised contempt. "Do you have any idea what people are saying about you in town? About how you're being taken in by a smooth-talking saddle tramp who'll charm you out of everything you own?" Ben stood slowly, the braided halter still in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an undertone of steel. "Seems to me that what Miss Price chooses to do with her time and her attention is her business, not yours." "Her business?" Marcus laughed harshly. "Son, you don't understand how things work in the real world. A woman with property like Lillian's needs protection from men who take advantage of her good nature." "The only person trying to take advantage here," Ben replied quietly, "is standing in the doorway, making threats." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped as he seemed to remember where he was. But the gesture was enough to reveal the violence that lurked beneath his civilized facade. "You've made your position clear, Turner," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences." As quickly as he'd appeared, Marcus vanished back into the storm, leaving behind only the echo of his threats and the lingering tension of confrontation. Ben and Lillian stood in silence for long moments, listening to the rain and processing what had just occurred. "He's dangerous," Lillian said finally. "I know," Ben replied, "but some things are worth the risk. In his hands, the braided halter caught the lamplight like a promise, a symbol of trust freely given and partnership built on mutual respect. Tomorrow, if Diablo was willing, it would be the first piece of tack the stallion had ever worn that honored his dignity, rather than asserting dominance over his spirit. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a sky so blue it seemed painted. Ben arrived at the corral, carrying the completed halter, its braided strands dark and supple from the oil he'd worked into them through the night. Diablo stood waiting, as if sensing that this day would bring something different, something that would change the careful balance they'd built together. But before Ben could enter the corral, riders approached from the direction of town. Sheriff Tom Bradley led the group, his badge catching the morning sun, followed by two men. Ben didn't recognize well-dressed strangers with the pale complexion of office workers and the serious expressions of men bearing bad news. Lillian emerged from the house, her face troubled as she took in the official nature of the visit. Ben remained by the corral gate, the halter in his hands, suddenly feeling less like a symbol of trust and more like evidence of time that might have run out. "Morning, Lillian," Sheriff Bradley said, removing his hat with the uncomfortable politeness of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm afraid I've got some legal business to discuss with you. These gentlemen are from the Territorial Land Office." The taller of the two strangers stepped forward, unfolding an official-looking document with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Miss Price, I'm Clerk Harrison from Santa Fe. I'm here regarding a dispute over the ownership of this property." "Dispute?" Lillian's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd just been blindsided. "There's no dispute. This ranch has been in my family for 15 years. My husband purchased it legally from the territorial government." "Yes, ma'am, we have those records," Harrison replied, consulting his papers. "However, a prior claim has been brought to our attention. It appears that this land was originally granted to one Josiah Blackwood in 1867, 2 years before your husband's purchase. The Blackwood family is asserting their legal right to reclaim the property." The words hit like a physical blow. Ben saw Lillian's face go pale, saw her hand move instinctively to the chain around her neck, where her husband's ring hung like a talisman against disaster. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "Thomas researched the title thoroughly before he bought this land. There were no prior claims." "I'm afraid the documentation suggests otherwise, ma'am." Harrison produced another set of papers, these bearing official seals and signatures that looked disturbingly authentic. "Mr. Marcus Blackwood has provided us with the original land grant, along with proof that his family never relinquished their claim to this property." Ben felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pieces began falling into place. Marcus's sudden appearance in Red Mesa, his aggressive pursuit of Lillian, his sister's visit with those silver spurs that had triggered Diablo's traumatic memories. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. "May I see those documents?" Ben asked quietly, stepping forward. Harrison looked surprised. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "A friend of Miss Price's, and someone with experience in land law." The clerk's eyebrows rose at this unexpected development. He glanced at Sheriff Bradley, who nodded encouragingly. Reluctantly, Harrison handed over the papers. Ben studied them with the careful attention of someone who knew what to look for. The documents were impressive: thick parchment, official seals, carefully worded legal language. But as he examined them more closely, his expression grew thoughtful, then grim. "These are very well done," he said finally, handing the papers back. "Professional quality. Someone went to considerable expense to create them." "Create them?" Harrison sputtered. "Sir, these are official territorial documents." "No," Ben interrupted, his voice carrying quiet authority. "They're forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder, waiting for a spark. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "That's a serious charge, Ben. You better be able to back it up." "I can," Ben replied calmly, "because I know something about territorial land grants that whoever forged these documents didn't." He turned to face the group, and something in his bearing had changed. Gone was the humble ranch hand, with dust on his clothes and deference in his voice. In his place stood a man with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority, someone whose words carried weight in courtrooms and legal proceedings. "The territorial seal used on these documents," Ben continued, "wasn't adopted until 1869, but these grants are supposedly from 1867. The forger made them too authentic, used the current seal instead of the one that would have been in use at the time." Harrison's face had gone from confident to uncertain to downright worried as Ben spoke. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because," Ben said quietly, "I spent 5 years as a territorial judge before I lost everything and took to drifting. I've seen hundreds of legitimate land grants, and I know how they should look." The revelation struck the assembled group like lightning. Lillian stared at Ben with a mixture of amazement, and something that might have been hurt here was yet another secret he'd kept, another layer of his past that he'd chosen not to share. "You're a judge?" Sheriff Bradley asked, his tone mixing respect with confusion. "Was a judge," Ben corrected. "Judge Benjamin Turner, 3rd Territorial District. At least until the night my wife and child died, and I decided the law hadn't done much to protect the things that mattered most." The pieces of Ben's story were falling into place now, painting a picture of a man who'd walked away from position and authority in his grief, choosing the open road over the responsibilities that had failed to save the people he loved most. But Harrison wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Even if you're right about the seal, which I'm not admitting, that doesn't prove these documents are forgeries. It could simply be an administrative error." "It could be," Ben agreed, "except for one other thing. Josiah Blackwood never existed." The statement fell into the morning air like a stone into still water. Harrison's mouth opened, then closed without sound. "I remember the name because it came up in a case I presided over 3 years ago," Ben continued. "A man named Marcus Blackwood tried to claim ownership of a silver mine using documents that referenced his ancestor, Josiah Blackwood. When we investigated, we discovered that Josiah Blackwood was a fictional character from a dime novel published in Denver. Marcus had simply borrowed the name for his fraudulent claim." Sheriff Bradley's expression had grown thunderous. "Are you telling me that Marcus Blackwood has been running a land grab scheme?" "I'm telling you that Marcus Blackwood is a confidence man who uses forged documents and fabricated family histories to steal property from legitimate owners. And I'm telling you that this isn't the first time he's tried it." The implications crashed over the group like a wave. Harrison was frantically shuffling through his papers, his confidence evaporating as the weight of evidence mounted against him. Sheriff Bradley was already reaching for his handcuffs, his duty as a lawman warring with his embarrassment at being taken in by such an elaborate deception. But it was Lillian's reaction that concerned Ben most. She stood silent and pale, staring at him as if seeing a stranger. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? About being a judge, about your experience with land law?" Ben's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. "Because I'm not that man anymore, Lillian. I walked away from all of that when I lost my family. I didn't want you to see me as Judge Turner with authority and position. I wanted you to see me as Ben, just Ben, and decide if that was enough. But you could have saved me days of worry if you'd spoken up sooner." "I could have," he admitted, "but then you might have wondered if I was helping you because of duty or because of something deeper. I needed you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with your property or your problems. They have to do with who you are when you're sitting by a corral at sunset, watching a man try to make friends with a horse. In the distance, as if responding to the emotional tension in the air, Diablo whinnied softly. The stallion had been watching the proceedings from his corral, and now he approached the fence where Ben's handmade halter lay forgotten on the ground. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Well, Judge Turner." "Just Ben," Ben corrected firmly. "Ben," the sheriff continued, "I reckon we need to ride into town and have a serious conversation with Mr. Blackwood about these documents and his business practices." As the men prepared to leave, Harrison gathered his fraudulent papers with the defeated air of someone whose elaborate scheme had just collapsed around him. But Ben wasn't finished. "Sheriff," he called out, "you might want to check with other territorial offices. I suspect you'll find that Marcus has tried this same scheme in multiple locations. A man with his talent for forgery doesn't usually limit himself to one victim." As the official party rode away, Ben and Lillian stood alone in the morning sunshine, the weight of revelation hanging between them like an unbuilt bridge. In the corral, Diablo moved closer to the fence, drawn perhaps by the scent of the hand-braided halter that lay waiting, a symbol of trust and partnership that suddenly seemed as fragile as the morning dew. The courthouse in Red Mesa had never seen such commotion. Word of Marcus Blackwood's fraudulent land claim had spread through the territory like wildfire, drawing ranchers, business owners, and curious townspeople from 50 miles around. By noon, the small building was packed to capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the street outside to await news of the proceedings. Ben sat at a scarred wooden table in the courthouse's main room, surrounded by law books and legal documents that had been hastily gathered from every available source. The familiar weight of legal responsibility settled on his shoulders like an old coat, uncomfortable after years of deliberately setting it aside, but still fitting well enough when duty called. Sheriff Bradley had returned from his confrontation with Marcus, bearing disturbing news. The confidence man had vanished in the night, taking with him several cases of documents and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. More troubling still, inquiries to other territorial offices had confirmed Ben's suspicions. Marcus had attempted similar schemes in at least 3 other locations, always targeting wealthy widows or elderly landowners who might be vulnerable to legal intimidation. "The bastard's been running this game for years," Sheriff Bradley had reported grimly. "Got away with it twice before anyone caught on. Made off with 2 profitable ranches and a mining claim before folks realized what he was up to." Now, as Ben prepared for the formal hearing that would determine Lillian's fate, he found himself fighting a familiar battle between his desire for privacy and his sense of justice. Every legal argument he crafted, every precedent he cited, every strategy he developed pushed him further back into the role he'd abandoned after losing his family. Lillian sat nearby, watching him work with an expression that mixed gratitude with something harder to read. The revelation of his past had created a distance between them that hadn't existed before, a careful politeness that felt worse than outright anger would have been. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. "I can hire attorneys from Phoenix or Santa Fe. You've already done more than enough." Ben looked up from the law book he'd been studying, his eyes tired but determined. "I want to do this, Lillian, not because I have to, but because it's right. Is that the only reason?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and unspoken hurt. Ben set down his pen and gave her his full attention. "You're angry with me," he said simply. "I'm confused," Lillian replied. "For weeks, I've been getting to know Ben Turner, the humble ranch hand who talks to horses and plays gentle music in the evening. Now I discover you're actually Judge Benjamin Turner, a man with education and legal expertise who could have ended this threat with a few words days ago. I'm the same person I was yesterday morning." "Are you?" Lillian's voice carried a note of pain that made Ben's chest tighten. "Because the man I thought I was falling in love with was someone who'd chosen honesty over advantage, simplicity over complexity. Now I find out you've been carrying secrets that could have changed everything." Ben was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "When I lost Sarah and our child, I lost faith in the law, in justice, in the whole system I devoted my life to serving. I walked away because I couldn't bear to be surrounded by the trappings of a life that had failed to protect what mattered most. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the crowd gathered in the street. I became Ben Turner the Drifter because Judge Benjamin Turner had failed at the most important case of his life, keeping his family safe. When I met you, I didn't want to be that failed judge. I wanted to be someone worthy of your respect. And you thought hiding your past would accomplish that? I thought earning your trust through patience and honesty would accomplish that. The fact that I used to wear a black robe and make legal decisions didn't seem relevant to whether I could sit quietly with a horse or play music that calmed a frightened animal. Lillian felt some of her anger dissolve at the raw pain in his voice. She could see now that his secrecy hadn't been born of deception, but of genuine humility, a desire to be valued for who he'd become, rather than who he'd once been. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't understand." "No," Ben replied, turning back to face her. "I should have told you. I should have trusted you with the whole truth, instead of letting you discover it this way." Before Lillian could respond, the courthouse door burst open, and Sheriff Bradley entered, with his face grim and his hand resting on his gun butt. "We've got problems," he announced without preamble. Marcus didn't just run. He left behind 3 hired guns with instructions to make sure this hearing doesn't go forward. Ben felt his blood chill. "Where are they?" "Spotted them, setting up positions around the courthouse about an hour ago. Professional gunmen, by the look of them. The kind who don't ask questions as long as the money's good." The crowd in the courthouse had fallen silent, picking up on the tension in the sheriff's voice. Outside, the gathering of spectators continued to grow, unaware of the danger that was closing in around them. "We need to evacuate the building," Ben said immediately. "Get everyone to safety." "Can't do that," Sheriff Bradley replied grimly. "Territorial Judge Morrison is riding in from Flagstaff for this hearing. If we don't proceed, Marcus's claim stands by default. Lillian loses everything." Ben began pacing, his legal mind racing through options and alternatives. How long until Judge Morrison arrives? 2 hours? Maybe 3. And the gunmen? Positioned to have clear shots at anyone entering or leaving the courthouse. They're not trying to hide. They want us to know they're there. Ben stopped pacing and looked directly at Lillian. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me enough to give me an honest answer." "What? Are you willing to risk everything on the chance that we can outsmart Marcus and his hired guns? Because if we proceed with this hearing, there's no guarantee that anyone walks away from it." Lillian met his gaze steadily, and in her eyes Ben saw the same courage that had enabled her to set an impossible test for her suitors, the same strength that had kept her going after her husband's death. "This ranch isn't just property to me," she said quietly. "It's the life Thomas and I built together, the future we planned, the legacy we hoped to leave. If I let Marcus steal it through fraud and intimidation, then everything we worked for dies with us." Ben nodded slowly. "Then we fight, but we do it smart." He turned to Sheriff Bradley. "I need you to gather every able-bodied man in town who can handle a gun. Set up a perimeter around the courthouse that the gunmen can't penetrate." "Ben," the sheriff said carefully, "you're talking about a war in the middle of town." "No," Ben replied, his voice carrying the authority of his former position. "I'm talking about justice. And sometimes justice requires good people to stand up to those who would use violence to pervert the law." As word spread through the crowd about the threat facing the hearing, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of fleeing, the townspeople began to organize. Ranchers who had driven hours to witness the proceedings volunteered to help defend the courthouse. Business owners closed their shops and retrieved hunting rifles from their homes. Even some of the women insisted on staying, arguing that they'd invested too much in seeing justice done to abandon it now. Ben watched the community rally with a mixture of pride and trepidation. These were good people willing to risk their safety for the principle that law should triumph over lawlessness. But they were also mostly farmers and shopkeepers facing professional killers. Courage alone might not be enough to see them through what was coming. As the afternoon wore on and Judge Morrison's arrival grew closer, Ben found himself preparing for the most important case of his career. Not because of its legal complexity, but because everything he'd come to value, Lillian's future, the community's faith in justice, and his own chance at redemption, hung in the balance. The courthouse bell began to toll, calling the hearing to order. Outside, 3 gunmen waited in the shadows, their weapons ready and their instructions clear. Inside, a former judge who'd lost everything to grief, prepared to risk everything again for love. But before the legal battle could begin, Ben had one more task to complete. He picked up the braided halter he'd brought from the ranch and looked at Lillian with eyes that held both determination and apology. "Win or lose," he said quietly, "there's something I need to finish first, something that can't wait any longer." Through the courthouse window, they could see Diablo in the corral behind Doc Peterson's office, where he'd been temporarily stabled for safety. The stallion stood alert and anxious, as if sensing the tension that gripped the entire town. "The hearing," Lillian began. "We'll wait," Ben interrupted firmly, "because whatever happens in that courtroom, I need you to know that the trust we've built means more to me than any legal victory ever could." As Ben headed for the door, the braided halter in his hands caught the afternoon light, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, a symbol of patience and partnership that would soon face its ultimate test. The temporary corral behind Doc Peterson's office was smaller than the one at Lillian's ranch, but Diablo filled it with his presence just the same. The stallion turned at Ben's approach, his dark eyes reflecting both recognition and the nervous energy that had been building throughout the day. Even a horse could sense when violence hung in the air, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Ben entered the corral slowly, the braided halter held loosely in his hands. Around them, the sounds of preparation continued, men taking positions, rifles being loaded, quiet conversations about courage and duty. But within the confines of the small enclosure, there was only the ancient dialogue between man and horse, predator and prey, learning to become partners. "I know this isn't the place I would have chosen," Ben said softly, settling into his familiar cross-legged position in the dirt. "But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of perfect timing." Diablo approached without hesitation now, the weeks of patient trust-building having created a bond stronger than the fear that had once defined him. The stallion's muzzle brushed against Ben's shoulder, a gesture of affection that would have been impossible just days before. From the courthouse window, Lillian watched with her heart in her throat. She could see Ben moving with deliberate calm, his hands gentle as he began the process of introducing Diablo to the braided halter. This wasn't about proving dominance or demonstrating control. This was about fulfilling a promise made in patience and sealed with mutual respect. Judge Morrison's carriage appeared at the far end of the street, dust rising from its wheels as it approached the courthouse. The territorial judge was a stern man, with grey whiskers and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades sorting truth from lies in frontier courtrooms. His arrival meant the hearing would begin within minutes, with or without Ben's presence. But Ben seemed oblivious to the approaching deadline. His attention was focused entirely on Diablo as he slowly, carefully raised the braided halter toward the stallion's magnificent head. This was the moment that 20 cowboys had tried to force, the submission that had been demanded rather than requested. Diablo could have pulled away, could have reared back in the old pattern of fear and defiance. Instead, the stallion lowered his head with the dignity of a king, accepting a crown, allowing Ben to slip the braided rope over his ears and adjust it with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "There," Ben whispered, his voice thick with something deeper than triumph. "You beautiful, brave creature. You've given me the greatest gift anyone could offer, your trust." The halter fit perfectly, its dark strands nearly invisible against Diablo's black coat. But more than the physical fit was the symbolic completion of a journey that had begun with violence and fear and ended with partnership and understanding. A commotion from the street drew Ben's attention. Through the courthouse windows, he could see Judge Morrison entering the building, followed by Sheriff Bradley and several armed townspeople. The hearing was about to begin, and with it, the legal battle that would determine not just Lillian's future, but the principle that justice could triumph over corruption. Ben rose slowly, his hand resting on Diablo's neck. The stallion stood calm and alert, the halter a symbol of the transformation they'd accomplished together. But as Ben prepared to leave for the courthouse, Diablo did something unexpected. He followed. "Easy, friend," Ben said, turning to face the horse. "This isn't your fight." But Diablo had other ideas. When Ben moved toward the corral gate, the stallion moved with him. When Ben stopped, Diablo stopped. It was as if the horse understood that the bond between them extended beyond the confines of a training exercise. It was a partnership that would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. From his saddlebags, which had been hastily retrieved from Lillian's ranch, Ben pulled out a collection of leather-bound books that seemed oddly out of place in the hands of a humble drifter. These were his law books, carried with him through years of wandering like relics of a former life he'd never quite been able to abandon. The sight of those books worn from use, marked with years of careful study, drove home the reality of who Ben truly was. Not just a gentle soul who could calm frightened animals, but a legal mind sharp enough to expose fraud and corruption at the highest levels. As Ben gathered his books and prepared to enter the courthouse, Lillian approached the corral. Diablo turned toward her, and for the first time since she'd owned him, the stallion allowed her to approach without tension or fear. The halter that Ben had crafted seemed to have transformed more than just the horse's willingness to be touched. It had somehow gentled his entire spirit. "He's beautiful," she said softly, reaching out to touch Diablo's neck. The stallion accepted her caress with calm dignity, as if recognizing that she, too, was part of the circle of trust that had been so carefully built. "He always was," Ben replied. "He just needed someone to see it." The courthouse bell began to toll again, calling all parties to order. Through the windows, they could see Judge Morrison taking his place at the bench, his stern face reflecting the gravity of the proceedings about to begin. Ben looked at Lillian one last time before entering the legal arena where his past and present would collide. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "know that these have been the best weeks of my life." "They're not over yet," Lillian replied firmly. "Win this case, Ben Turner. Win it for all of us." As Ben walked toward the courthouse, his law books tucked under his arm and his heart full of purpose, Diablo watched from the corral with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. The bond between them was complete, sealed not with force or dominance, but with the kind of trust that could weather any storm. The courthouse fell silent as Ben entered, his law books under his arm, and his bearing transformed from humble ranch hand to legal advocate. Judge Morrison looked up from the papers before him, his stern eyes taking in Ben's appearance with the practiced assessment of a man who'd seen every type of frontier attorney. "Your Honor," Ben said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of courtroom protocol, "I am Benjamin Turner, formerly of the 3rd Territorial District Court, representing Miss Lillian Price in this matter." A murmur ran through the packed courtroom. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Ben's judicial background. "Judge Turner, I've heard of your work. Thought you'd left the territory." "I did, Your Honor. Personal circumstances required a change of venue." Ben placed his books on the table and opened the first volume with practiced efficiency. "But I'm here today because this case represents more than a simple property dispute. It's an attempt to pervert the law through systematic fraud." Clerk Harrison, who had been whispering urgently with another territorial official, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, we have serious concerns about Mr. Turner's allegations. The Blackwood family claim appears to be properly documented, with forged documents." Ben interrupted, pulling out a carefully prepared exhibit. "Your Honor, if I may present evidence that will conclusively prove the fraudulent nature of these land grants." Judge Morrison gestured for Ben to proceed. What followed was a masterful display of legal expertise as Ben methodically dismantled Marcus's scheme. He presented the anachronistic territorial seal, cited precedents regarding fictional claimants, and referenced his own experience with Marcus's previous fraudulent attempts. But as Ben built his case, tension was mounting outside the courthouse. Through the windows, the gathered crowd could see three figures moving closer to the building, Marcus's hired gunmen, finally making their play to disrupt the proceedings through violence. Sheriff Bradley slipped into the courtroom and whispered urgently in Judge Morrison's ear. The judge's face grew grim as he learned of the threat developing outside his courtroom. "Mr. Turner," Judge Morrison said quietly, "I'm told we may have a security situation developing. Perhaps we should postpone." "No, Your Honor." Ben's voice was firm, resolute. "Postponement is exactly what these men want. They're counting on intimidation to prevent justice from being served." The courthouse doors suddenly burst open, and Marcus Blackwood strode in with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. Behind him came two of his hired gunmen, their weapons visible and their intentions clear. "Your Honor," Marcus announced with theatrical courtesy, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my family's legitimate claim to this property." Judge Morrison's face darkened with anger. "Mr. Blackwood, you will remove those armed men from my courtroom immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Judge," Marcus replied, his mask of civility finally slipping. "You see, this hearing ends now, with a ruling in my favor. Otherwise, people are going to get hurt." The packed courtroom erupted in shouts of outrage and fear. Some people tried to flee toward the exits, only to find their way blocked by the third gunman who had positioned himself at the rear door. But many of the townspeople stood their ground, their own weapons drawn in defiance of Marcus's threats. "You're making a serious mistake," Ben said calmly, rising from his chair. "Threatening a territorial judge is a federal crime." Marcus laughed harshly. "What are you going to do about it, Judge? Your law books don't stop bullets." "No," Ben agreed quietly, "but they can expose truth. And truth has a way of making even desperate men reconsider their choices." He pulled out a final document from his collection, a telegram that had arrived just that morning. "This is from the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. It seems they've been tracking a confidence man named Marcus Blake, your real name, for the past 2 years. You're wanted in connection with land fraud in 3 territories. Marcus's face went pale as Ben continued reading. "The Marshal and a federal posse are already en route to Red Mesa. They should arrive within the hour." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully constructed identity, his elaborate scheme, his confidence in being able to intimidate his way to victory, all of it crumbled in the face of Ben's methodical preparation. "You're bluffing," Marcus snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Ben asked calmly. "Sheriff Bradley, would you care to confirm the telegram?" Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his badge catching the courtroom light. "It's true, Marcus, or should I say Blake. The federal warrant came through this morning. You're done." For a moment that felt like eternity, Marcus stood frozen between rage and panic. His hired gunmen shifted nervously, suddenly realizing they were facing not just local resistance, but federal law enforcement. Then, like a dam bursting, Marcus's control shattered completely. "If I can't have this ranch," he screamed, drawing his own weapon, "then nobody can." But as he raised his gun toward Lillian, the courthouse doors exploded open once more. Through them charged Diablo, the magnificent stallion responding to some instinct that told him his human partners were in mortal danger. On his back, bareback and fearless, rode the town's blacksmith, who had seen the threat developing and made a desperate choice. The sight of the coal-black stallion bursting into the courtroom like an avenging spirit was enough to scatter the gunmen and send Marcus stumbling backward. In the chaos that followed, Sheriff Bradley and his deputized citizens overwhelmed the criminals, and justice, supported by courage and community, finally prevailed. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Ben found himself standing beside Lillian, both of them staring in amazement at Diablo, who stood calmly in the center of the courthouse, as if he belonged there. The perfect saddle that the town's leatherworker had been crafting in secret now adorned the stallion's back, a symbol of the transformation from wild creature to willing partner that had inspired an entire community to stand up for what was right. 3 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across the Price Ranch, as the entire community of Red Mesa gathered for a celebration that had been weeks in the planning. The cottonwoods along the creek wore their autumn colors like wedding finery, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. But today was about beginnings, not endings, about partnerships built to last through all seasons. Ben stood on the front porch of the ranch house, adjusting the collar of his best shirt, still humble by most standards, but clean and pressed with care. In his pocket rested a simple gold band, modest in appearance but rich in meaning. He had purchased it with money earned from his new position as Red Mesa's magistrate, a role the territorial government had offered after witnessing his handling of the Blackwood case. The crowd gathered in the ranch yard represented more than just wedding guests. They were witnesses to a transformation that had touched the entire community. Sheriff Bradley stood with his wife, both of them beaming with the satisfaction of justice well served. Doc Peterson had brought his medical bag, as was his habit at any large gathering, but his face held the contentment of a man who'd watched healing triumph over hurt. Even Mrs. Hutchins, the town's greatest source of gossip, had tears in her eyes as she watched the preparations. At the center of it all, in the place of honor near the altar that had been constructed beneath the old oak trees, stood Diablo. The magnificent stallion wore his handcrafted saddle with dignified grace, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. Around his neck hung garlands of autumn flowers, placed there by the town's children who had adopted him as their own symbol of hope and transformation. But it was the scene near the corral that drew every eye and warmed every heart. Lillian emerged from the house wearing a dress of simple white cotton that managed to be more elegant than the finest silk. Her auburn hair was arranged with wild flowers from her own garden, and around her neck, instead of her late husband's ring, hung a delicate chain holding a small charm, a tiny horseshoe that Ben had crafted from one of Diablo's naturally shed shoes. As she walked toward the assembled crowd, Ben felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the woman who had set an impossible test, not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. This was the woman who had seen past his humble exterior to the man within. This was the woman who had taught him that love, like trust, was something to be earned rather than taken. The minister, a circuit preacher, who traveled between the scattered communities of the territory, opened his worn Bible and began the ceremony with words that seemed written specifically for this moment and this couple. Dearly beloved, we gather today not just to witness the union of two hearts, but to celebrate the triumph of patience over force, understanding over dominance, and love over fear. As the vows were exchanged, Diablo stood as still as a statue, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment. When Ben promised to cherish and protect Lillian with the same patience he had shown her beloved Stallion, the horse whickered softly in what the crowd chose to interpret as approval. When Lillian vowed to trust Ben with her heart, as completely as Diablo had learned to trust him with his spirit, tears flowed freely among the assembled witnesses. This was more than a wedding. It was the completion of a story that had begun with broken trust and ended with partnership built on mutual respect. The rings were exchanged with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. Ben's simple gold band joined Lillian's on her finger, symbols of promises made not in passion's heat, but in wisdom's calm. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the valley. But the most memorable moment came when Ben, instead of immediately kissing his bride, walked to Diablo and gently took the stallion's lead rope. With quiet dignity, he led the horse to where Lillian stood, then helped her mount the magnificent creature she had never before been able to ride. The symbolism was lost on no one. Here was trust completed, partnership perfected, and love demonstrated not through grand gestures, but through the patient building of understanding. As Ben swung up behind Lillian, and they rode Diablo together around the ranch yard, the cheers of the crowd followed them like a blessing. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the community. Musicians appeared with fiddles and harmonicas, filling the air with melodies that spoke of joy and hope. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding its own music to the festivities. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ben found himself standing with Lillian beside Diablo's corral. The stallion grazed peacefully in the evening light, no longer the wild, untamable creature that had frustrated 20 cowboys. He was still magnificent, still powerful, still possessing all the qualities that had made him special, but now those qualities were partnered with trust rather than opposed by fear. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd tried to break him the way the others did?" Lillian asked, her hand resting on Ben's arm. Ben smiled, pulling her closer as they watched their beloved horse enjoy the peaceful evening. "I think I know exactly what would have happened. I would have failed, just like all the others. Because you can't break something beautiful and expect it to remain beautiful. You can only help it discover its own magnificence." "Is that what you did for me?" Lillian asked softly. "No," Ben replied, his voice tender with love and understanding. "That's what you did for me. You saw past the broken man I'd become to the person I could be again. You gave me a chance to prove that patience and gentleness could triumph over force and fear." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the newlyweds stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of their community celebrating and their horse contentedly grazing. They had learned, through trial and patience, that the greatest victories come not from conquering what stands before us, but from understanding it. In the distance, a harmonica played a gentle lullaby, the same melody Ben had used to calm Diablo's fears so many evenings ago. It drifted across the ranch like a benediction, carrying with it the promise that some bonds, once forged in patience and sealed with trust, would endure for all the seasons yet to come. The wild stallion had been tamed, but not broken. The wealthy widow had found her partner, but not her master. And the poor cowboy had discovered that the greatest riches in life were not measured in gold or land, but in the trust freely given by those we learn to love through patience, understanding, and time.